I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. Well, to start things off today, we're recording on Earth Day. So how was your Earth Day?
It was amazing. I'm tired personally, but that doesn't have anything to do with it being Earth Day. I've just been slammed. I feel like I'm about ready to go put a blanket of earth over the top of me and just give back to the world, just
Wow.
turn up some daisies.
This took a dark turn.
No, I'm just take a long nap. No, it was good. It was actually a really beautiful day here, and I felt like there is a lot of excitement on a lot of fronts about climate that I just noticed all over the place, and I was kind of pumped up. I don't know if you caught any of Biden's executive order that he announced today in Seattle, but Biden had an executive order about protecting forest and just a lot of overall work with conservation and other things about defining some old growth forests. I didn't really realize that there wasn't like a standard definition of what an old growth forest is, but that was part of the announcement, was that they're going to kind of standardize, categorize, and protect some old growth forest. And one of the other things was, they're going to do some work with communities and nonprofits, industries, and unions to create forest-related economic opportunities. So yeah, there was some cool stuff going on. Did you catch that?
I didn't listen to the speech, but I did catch the highlights, and I think it was a positive thing, right? I mean, we got to count our wins or celebrate our wins these days. So
For sure.
It seemed like it was pretty thoughtfully done. They were focused on the resilience piece, making our forest more resilient to wildfire.
Right.
Focused on the conservation piece, as you mentioned. There was discussion too of like boosting funding and accelerating reforestation, which I thought was good. So our topic this week is refrigerants, and refrigerants being those products, that make your AC in your car work, keep the food in your fridge cool. And I recognize as we kick this off that it's probably not the sexiest topic in the world, but when it comes to but when it comes to climate change, it's a critical one
For sure.
But before we go there, wanted to talk about this week's reason for hope. There's signs in the U.S. House that climate action might finally be getting some legs. Representative Jamie Raskin, who's a leader on the liberal side of things, just did a recent interview with Reuters where he is optimistic about the prospects of passing climate legislation. He said is quoted as saying we should cut the deals that we need to be cut. I think a recognition that we're not going to be able to pass this much broader, more sweeping kind of Build Back Better bill, but that there are climate provisions that should and need to move forward. And then on the flip side, I guess it's hard to tell. I mean, Senator Manchin says something different every week, but I guess recently he indicated that he had a willingness to support the climate change investments if it was paid for by raising tax revenues and lowering the costs of prescription drugs covered by Medicare, which seem like small demands from a guy who usually wants all sorts of stuff. But from my perspective, I mean, Democrats should offer Manchin whatever he wants. I mean, if that's billions of dollars headed to West Virginia to help retool a coal miner workforce, if that's giving the guy an upgrade on his houseboat using one of those yachts they seized from Putin's buddies. I mean, whatever it takes at this point.
He'll be in there going, I can't read any of this. It's all in Russian. I didn't mean to back into it. It was opposites.
In all seriousness, I know that he's a real moving target, but whatever they need to do to cut a deal is really what needs to happen. So pivoting to today's topic, refrigeration and cooling equipment are important in really in two ways when it comes to climate change. There are the refrigerants that, we're going to talk about today. And then there's also the electricity demand. I mean, anybody who lives in a hot place and has had to pay an air conditioning bill knows that air conditioning is an energy hog. And so, there are really two facets to it. What we're going to talk about today is really focused on the refrigerant side, but I do think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that there is sort of this dual impact when we're talking about refrigeration and cooling. Interestingly, for those who might not be aware, refrigerants are responsible for around 11% of total warming emissions to date.
Hmm.
And the demand for air conditioners is really set to skyrocket, over the next 30 years. It's estimated that we could be shifting from about 3.5 billion AC units worldwide to 9.5 by 2050, which
Whew.
is massive and underscores the importance of dealing with this, refrigerants issue.
Yeah.
Our guest today is Christina Starr from the Environmental Investigation Agency. Her focus is on eliminating super greenhouse gases called hydrofluorocarbons used as refrigerants in the cooling sector. She's participated in international and domestic climate negotiations on HFCs for the past 8 years, including at the Montreal Protocol and with the US EPA. So I will attest to the fact if you ever wanted an expert on refrigerants, Christina Starr is your person.
Sweet.
Christina, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here.
So let's start you off with a basic question. When you think about efforts to address climate change, what gives you hope?
Thank you for asking this. I think it's an important question, and in this work on climate, there's always a fine balance we need to strike between, on the one hand, maintaining urgency about the stark reality that we face on this being a key decade for us to act on climate change.
Right.
And on the other hand, making sure we're armed with hope and knowledge that these goals are still very much within our grasp. And I think there are two things that make me hopeful overall. One is the knowledge that we really have the technologies and solutions we need to reach our climate goals, and it's just a matter of implementing and scaling up their adoption much more rapidly. And the second thing is I'm really hopeful because I think people from many walks of life and across the political spectrum are starting to realize that climate action isn't just about sacrifice or saying no to things. It's really about opportunities and benefits, both economically and socially.
I don't think I've heard it put that way, but I think that's a great point. I mean, all too often sort of fixated on the problem and debates about the perceived negative economic impacts without recognizing that, this will mean cleaner air, has a chance to address, climate justice. Well, let's dive into refrigerants. So maybe starting with where refrigerants are used, beyond maybe the obvious, and how those are linked to climate change.
Yeah, so refrigerants are all around us every day, and most of us don't even know it, and we're not aware of them. But they're basically used in any type of cooling system, whether it's in our home air conditioner, our household refrigerator, in our car air conditioner, and even in commercial settings like our supermarkets. They come into play in our cold food chain as well as in our vaccine cooling, for example. So they're really everywhere.
And some folks may already be aware, but there's obviously a downside to some of the refrigerants that are used. And yeah, wonder if you can kind of speak to that. Why are refrigerants, or at least some of the refrigerants that we've used, today or historically, are problematic for climate change?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the refrigerants we're most commonly using now are these synthetic chemicals. They're produced by large chemical companies, designed in labs as molecules, and then produced in factories. And they are fluorinated chemicals known as hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. And HFCs are really potent greenhouse gases. It turns out that per molecule compared to carbon dioxide, they have thousands of times the global warming impact. The fortunate flip side of that is that they also are what are known as short-lived climate pollutants. So they actually break down fairly quickly in the atmosphere. They have a lifetime of about 15 years. So that means that if we mitigate their emissions now, we see pretty rapid results in the atmosphere in terms of reducing warming.
So I guess that is one of the silver lining, that there is sort of just a transient impact, and maybe some ways, comparable to methane, where, methane breaks down much more quickly than having carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Exactly.
So it sounds like, clearly they're much more potent. How big of an impact are we talking, when we're talking about refrigerants and global warming potential?
Yeah. So, right now, if we look at all the emissions from all greenhouse gases in the world, HFCs probably only make up around 2 to 3%. But that is increasing really quickly because HFCs are still being adopted as replacements for previous generations of refrigerants that are being phased out, which are the ozone depleting refrigerants that are regulated under the Montreal Protocol. So, we're still increasing our adoption of them. And then you combine that with the fact that a lot of countries around the world have more and more demand for cooling, whether it be in their cold food chains or for air conditioning. And so, if we don't act now to transition away from HFCs, they could end up contributing about 20% of all of our emissions within the next few decades. So, it's a really significant part of the climate problem. And what we know and what scientists tell us is that reducing HFCs globally can prevent about half a degree of warming in this century. So
Wow.
that's truly significant. And in fact, it's a really vital piece of the strategy to meet our climate goals under the Paris Agreement. When we think about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's getting us, half a degree towards that target.
That's huge when you put it in that context. As listeners know, it's like every tenth of a degree, we go above 1.5 is very problematic. So yeah, half a degree is massive. Um, so it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, what we're looking at is like an existing problem, but a problem that has the potential to get much worse given the growing need for air conditioning around the world, right? As we warm up as a globe, it could turn into a much larger problem if we don't curb the HFCs that are being used now.
Absolutely. That's right.
And so I guess that leads to the obvious question, which is, what kind of solutions are available?
Yeah, so I would kind of put the solutions to this problem into two buckets. And the first one is sort of transitioning away from using HFCs in our cooling equipment to using other things, to using alternatives. And then the second bucket, I would say, and I can talk a bit more about that, is better preventing the emissions of the refrigerants that are already out there in the world in the equipment that we're using now. And so, in this first area, this is where, really fortunately, there are alternatives to HFCs that we can use as refrigerants. So, there are non synthetic molecules, or what are known as natural refrigerants, that are things that were around before we invented HFCs and have been used in cooling in the past. And those are things like carbon dioxide is actually a good refrigerant, hydrocarbons, and ammonia. Interestingly, carbon dioxide, which we all think of as the most widely abundant greenhouse gas and part of the problem, when we compare it to, obviously, a hydrofluorocarbon, an HFC, that has a global warming potential of 4,000 or 5,000 times CO2. CO2 is actually a really huge improvement.
Right.
So what we're really aiming for at the end of the day is to adopt other refrigerants that have either a zero or almost a zero global warming potential in this equipment. And that's starting to happen a lot. We already see supermarkets, for example, using these carbon dioxide refrigeration systems, especially in Europe, where they're a little bit further along in this transition than we are here in the United States. But there are a lot of examples. These solutions are already out there, and we're already transitioning to them. And really what we need to do is sort of accelerate that process. And then aside from that idea, which is a little bit of a gradual thing, right? You can only replace a refrigerant most of the time when you're buying a new piece of equipment, right? But in the meantime, that piece of equipment is still there. It's being used and it's leaking. And so the emissions happen both during its use and then when we go to throw out that piece of equipment, what happens to the gas when it's being disposed of. And unfortunately, it's a pretty common practice that the refrigerant is being vented into the atmosphere instead of being captured, recovered from that equipment, and either it can be recycled and reused in another piece of equipment that maybe still needs it. Or we actually also have widely available technologies for destruction of HFCs. So the other piece of this really is creating the solutions throughout the existing life cycle of these products for reducing the leaks, and then recovering, capturing the gases, and either reusing them or destroying them. And this is an area that we really need to do a lot more in. Just to give you an idea, for example, I mentioned supermarkets earlier being these major users of HFCs. Each supermarket contains maybe around 3,000 pounds of HFC gases, which ends up leaking at a rate of about 25% a year. And when you translate that into emissions, it's equivalent to the emissions from driving about 400 cars. So if we can reduce those leaks, if we can make sure the devices to detect HFC leaks are installed, so we can bring those leak rates down. So that's one way we can, take really quick action.
So it sounds like you talked about the two buckets. There's really sort of this front end issue, which is let's stop using the, refrigerants that are problematic. But then with the recognition that there's still all of these existing appliances that are out there. And it sounds like in that case, there's sort of two pieces. One is making sure as they operate that they're not leaking. And then this, disposal at end of life. And it sounds like those are all, technically feasible. It's just a matter of ensuring that they take place.
Everything's technically feasible. There's no kind of, oh no, what are we going to do? We can't get rid of HFCs. It's all the solutions are definitely available, which is what makes mitigating HFCs such a kind of a low-hanging fruit. And there's also the fact that we've done this before with other refrigerants. The Montreal Protocol has already phased out ozone-depleting refrigerants, and we're essentially trying to do the same thing again. The piece we haven't really ever tackled has been this life cycle management piece, truly eliminating the emissions, especially these end-of-life emissions. But it's a big opportunity because when you can recycle, an HFC, if you take it out of a piece of equipment, that then gives that HFC some value at its end of life. It creates an opportunity for someone to actually create a business of reusing.
So hearing you talk about recycling of HFCs, I guess generated another question, which is, let's say I have a car that's, running on HFCs today. If I need to get that air conditioner serviced, unfortunately, I still have to use HFCs. In other words, I can't, go to my local car garage and get them to swap out for something else. So there is continuing to be a need for HFCs for these products that are still in use. Is that fair?
Yes, that's right. But what you can do, say you take your car in to get it serviced, if there is a problem with the air conditioner that contains an HFC, you want to make sure that they're actually solving the problem if they have to replace any of the refrigerant in it, right? Rather than just adding more refrigerant and not fixing the leak that was leading to a problem in the first place.
So I guess obviously concerning to hear that refrigerants, or some of these historical refrigerants have such a huge global warming potential, but exciting that there are solutions. And I guess that leads to, how do we make these things happen, right? And if they're all technically feasible, what are the best ways to ensure that we can implement these at scale and avoid, more of them escaping into the atmosphere?
Yeah, so we very much need the right policies and regulations in place, both at a global level as well as nationally to do this. One really hopeful thing we have with HFCs is a global agreement under the Montreal Protocol called the Kigali Amendment, which agrees to phase down HFCs by about 85% over the next 25 years. So this phase down is already going into effect, and we actually have legislation that has passed by US Congress to implement this. So it's given the US Environmental Protection Agency a really broad scope of authority to regulate HFCs. And that's in the process of beginning to be implemented now. But it's not a phase out yet. It's just a phase down. And there are those, including me, who think that this could actually go faster and needs to go faster. We need to make sure we're transitioning actually to the refrigerants that have a zero or a near zero global warming potential, not to new synthetic molecules that are being invented that are sort of a little bit better, but really don't get us to that end goal.
So it sounds like positive momentum, but there's still some tweaks that need to be made. What's sort of the vision at this point for how vehicles, how my window air conditioner or refrigerator might be dealt with?
Yeah, well, there are things you can do as an individual, and I think we really do need. Most people are not even aware that these gases exist. So you have a step up if you're listening to this and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm sitting on super greenhouse gases in my garage and in my window AC unit that I'm planning to toss out before this summer. So certainly there are things you can do as an individual. Number one is that if you're going to throw out your AC or your old equipment, look into approved programs that will recover the refrigerant. There's actually an approved list of EPA partners for a voluntary refrigerant recovery program. It's called the Responsible Appliance Disposal Program, or the RAD program. So you can go on EPA's website, you can check that out. And another thing, you can actually, organizations like mine are trying to engage people in doing actual advocacy. So we have a website called climatefriendlysupermarkets.org. And we have a citizen science project where folks can actually add their local supermarket to an interactive map. They can go in and take a picture of a label that says what refrigerant is in that supermarket, send it in to us, and we'll add that to the map. And you can just see, looking at this map, that there are already many hundreds of stores across the country using HFC-free refrigeration systems, but there are many that are not and are still using these things. So, there are ways and tools there for how you could perhaps engage with that company and ask them questions about, what are their climate goals with regard to reducing refrigerants. We also have a list of HFC-free refrigerator models on EIA's website that folks can go. And I don't know if you provide links with the podcast or anything like that, but we could give you some of those.
We do. Yeah, that'd be great. So the U.S. sounds like is on the right path. We need to accelerate that path. What does the global picture look like?
Yeah, so at this point, I think more than 200 countries have actually ratified the Kigali Amendment and signed on to this global phase down. I think that's a really hopeful start. And so what that means is that a lot of countries with a lot less capacity and resources than the United States will need support to do that. But we're in a hopeful spot, at a global level as well. It's going to be a lot of work to implement this and to make sure that we are implementing it properly.
Sure.
One of the dark sides of this is that when you start phasing down something, when you start limiting its availability, you can create black markets or illegal trade in these substances as well, and see that starting to pop up. These gases, actually, we've seen this in the previous phase outs of ozone depleting refrigerants, suddenly become really valuable to the point where some of the same criminal networks that were trading in illegal drugs in the 90s were suddenly became involved in trading in refrigerants, in illegal refrigerants.
Wow.
So we've seen this happen before. I think, fortunately, we hope that the US EPA is going to take a really strong approach to implementing this and enforcing it.
So I guess, kind of stepping back and recapping a little bit, we have this problem with, HFCs that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed now, given the potential negative impacts in the future if we don't get to it. But the positive news, if you will, is that we have all the tools that we need to address it. And so wondering, if we can end with, and you spoke to this a little bit already, but like, if individuals want to get involved, that this is something that resonates with them, what would you suggest that they consider for potential advocacy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that people can do here, and ranging from what you do in your own home with the use of and buying new equipment, that uses this stuff. So if you are going to throw out your old air conditioner, make sure that you're using someone for that service who is an EPA approved partner of the RAD program, which is the Responsible Appliance Disposal Program. If you were going to buy a new fridge or a new air conditioner, head over to EIA's website for a resource on a list of HFC-free refrigerator models that are available. And then lastly, you can really be an advocate for this issue, both engaging with companies and with the EPA and its implementation of this regulation. And we have a website dedicated to advocating with supermarkets. You can add your local supermarket to a map. So really encourage people to head to EIA's website and check it out.
Great. Well, we'll definitely have a link because it sounds like there's multiple opportunities to get involved. Well, Christina, thank you so much for making the time to come and talk with us about a critical topic that for a lot of people is probably something that isn't even on their radar.
Thanks for having me, Jason. It's been great to be here and hope that your listeners are inspired to go out and find this new unknown area of climate action they can take part in.
So Todd, what were your thoughts on the interview with Christina?
Well, I don't know if you know this, Jason, but I am in the business of facilities. So I consider myself to be somewhat of an expert on these topics. No, actually, I pretty much just pay one set of people to do work that makes this other set of people quit calling me. But I do know about HFCs, though. And of course, this kind of ties in a little bit to the tail end of our episode that we did on CFCs and the ozone. So I was, familiar with the topic, but maybe I didn't quite realize kind of the impact of some of these numbers that I'm looking at, about the number you had about they're responsible for around 11% of total warming to date. And what Christina was talking about, that they'll, that these HFC emissions are projected to contribute, the equivalent of 20% of CO2 by 2050, and could prevent a 0.5 degree Celsius of warming if we don't do what needs to be done, right? What were some of your takeaways?
I think, first and foremost was really that we really need to, as Christina said, accelerate this effort, because it's one of those efforts that, all the solutions exist. There seems to be generally agreement that we need to do it. And so it's like, why don't we move faster?
Yeah, and I'm curious too. And I think you asked this question in the interview, and I just want to make sure that I got the answer correct, that if there's any equipment that's already kind of been built with certain HFCs as the refrigerant type, that it doesn't sound like you can just kind of pump something else into the system. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Obviously it makes it problematic given that you have all these, existing appliances and air conditioners and cars and all this stuff that basically we're stuck with until you can replace it with a new piece of equipment that doesn't run on HFCs.
I wonder if there's a possibility with some of these more kind of commercial sized systems that are out there in large buildings, if there's a way to retool certain portions of the system. I get it. Like if you got some window shaker in your house, some window unit, you're not gonna pull
It's not
the
worth
pieces
it,
out
right?
of that, the cooling loop out of it. It's not worth it. But maybe some of these larger systems that are in place at some of these buildings, especially if it's been recently installed.
I think you're right, though. It seems like that would be a logical place to start. And maybe that technology exists where you're able to kind of do a retrofit and a swap out.
I guess in my world, the professional world that I live in, we take care of a lot of assets, and a lot of it's HVAC equipment. And there's a lot of these questions going on right now.
You make a good point, though. And I think, the other thing that we really should be emphasizing that's getting attention, but ought to be moving more quickly too, is the adoption of more aggressive, building code and efficiency standards. Because the reality is, if we have more efficient buildings, that means less AC capacity, which means less refrigerants, regardless of what they are, right?
So I wanted to ask you about the EPA regulation that was released last fall. And in that same vein, also ask you about the Kigali Amendment that Christina was talking about and how they compare to one another, because they seem kind of similar. They seem like they have similar goals.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the Kigali Amendment that Christina mentioned, it's really an agreement to reduce HFCs, in this case by 80% by the year 2047, if I'm getting
Okay.
that right. And, I think the only thing disappointing about that is it's a phase down and not a phase out. But,
Okay.
and then you look at the, recent EPA regulation, and same thing, right? It's intended to be a phase down. The numbers are a little more aggressive. So the EPA with their program is, saying that they're going to cut HFCs by 85% over the next 15 years. So
Okay.
yeah, so I think they're complementary, right? I think
Yeah.
if I'm understanding the Kigali Amendment, what really needs to happen is for other countries to create sort of their legislation that backs up or aligns with the commitment. It's interesting as kind of dug into this topic to learn that, we're talking about HFCs and replacements, that Greenpeace was on this way back in the day. I mean, in 92, 93, they actually
Huh.
developed and helped commercialize a hydrocarbon refrigerator using a chemical called isobutane as a refrigerant. And then, Christine had mentioned that that's one of sort of the options for like natural refrigerants or hydrocarbons. So kind of
Cool.
crazy that they saw the writing on the wall back then and were, working to develop a solution.
Yeah.
They named it Green Freeze and made it freely available, to the world. So I thought,
Very cool.
yeah, definitely a lot of forethought there.
That's awesome.
So naturally, this all leads to, what can we do? And I think Christina did a great job of laying out, potential actions that we can take personally. And I think the emphasis from my perspective should really be on educating your friends and family about HFCs and the need to dispose of, these cooling devices responsibly, and that we need to be thinking about, climate friendly alternatives when we're buying new. So yeah, tell your friends about HFCs, and we'll have links on our website to all the information that Christina talked about. The other action we'd like to encourage folks to take is to tell the EPA to ramp up their efforts to deal with both the reclamation and the disposal of refrigerants from appliances at their end of life. Really, every consumer should have easy access to disposal options when they purchase a new appliance. We'll have some talking points on our website to send those in. Really need the EPA to ramp up their efforts there so that we can ensure that window shakers or fridges or air conditioners at cars, that all of that at the end of life is being disposed of effectively.
Definitely.
Well, I think that's a wrap. Thanks again to everybody for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.